Welcome to Nailing It Down, and today we're going to talk about what we're talking about when we talk about class. And I'm going to start off with the proposition that's going to anger many of my fellow Marxists. Class is a descriptive category of the conflicts in society that arose around the social reproduction of a society. All right? It asserts that an individual's position in a class hierarchy is determined primarily, although not solely, by their role in the production process or the management of that production process. And political and ideological consciousness are in aggregate determined by class position. Now, that last part is crucial because Marx actually talks about proletarianization both as a process which other classes are made precarious and more like the proletariat, but also as an ideological process where people from other classes can see themselves in their future in the future of the proletariat, which means that political and ideological consciousness is not solely determined by one's class position, but it is the way the class as a whole is most likely to act. Now, if we take Lenin's dictum that we should know the classes, their sensuous life, their ideologicals, their mode of thinking, and of all the classes, that Marxists should be familiar and fluent in the movement of all the classes, we can see here that highly reified notions of class are actually not something Marxists are supposed to do. Now, Marx talks about three kinds of basic class divisions which come up in classical political economy: rentiers, capitalists, and workers. Now, in our world, the line between rentier capitalism and productive capitalism has greatly diminished. I mean, it's no longer clear to even capitalists where one begins and the other ends. If you don't believe me, you must then accept, for example, that intellectual property protections are a kind of rent. All right. Things that require the state to intervene for you and not just move the selling of commodities requires rents, which is enforced payments enforced by legal fiat. All right. Now, the rentier, capitalist, and worker mode is the construction of David Ricardo. Marx, however, does not just accept Ricardo's lines. I mean, it is a critique of classical political economy. Capitalists and the bourgeoisie own the means of production and purchase the labor powers of others. Workers of the proletariat do not own the means of production. They are propertyless. That's what proletariat means. And property here means productive property, not just personal property. Like your house, if the bank co-owns it with you, and you don't rent it out, it's not your personal. I mean, it's not your productive property. You have full use rights to it. You can do stuff with it, but you can't live off it by itself. So it's not productive property, right? Then proletariats have to sell their own labor power, which they sell themselves as a commodity. This is the driving factor of capital. Now, there are scholars who think that we should not talk about other categories that come up in Marx, and there are additional classes that come up in Marx as classes in the Marxian sense. Sometimes they are called social categories. Right? There is the petit bourgeois and the peasantry. The petit bourgeois owns its sufficient means of production, but does not purchase labor power, meaning that they don't have workers. Petit bourgeois are their workers of their family or some other smaller arrangement, but they don't purchase labor power en masse. So if you are able to sell your skills or collect rents, we might talk about the petit rentier now, actually. This is another thing that may have come up since then. Marx's Communist Manifesto doesn't define petit bourgeois beyond small capitalist, but later writings make it clear. There's also the lumpen proletariat, which is the people who are referred to as the dangerous class or the social scum that passively rotting throw off the lowest layers of the old society. And the lumpen proletariat is people who live outside of class relations but live off other people, who exploit other people, or who are just highly, highly precarious and have to dip in and out of criminality. And in Marx's letters, the lumpen proletariat's actually broken down into two categories: the true lumpen proletariat, or the lumpen proletariat so-called, and the true lumpen proletariat are more active people who exploit other ends of society. And then the lumpen proletariat so-called are people who are partially proletariat, like seasonal workers, the elderly. There's all kinds of things in Marx. And these debates about lumpen spread throughout early Marxist work. I am of the opinion that lumpenization is a process that we can understand, where people have to dip into informal or gray or black market means or other kinds of exploitation, and both of self and others, to survive, but that that we should view it in contemporary society as a spectrum, because there's many people who are in and out of both the lumpen and the working class in Marxist structures. But if this doesn't feel like it describes all of capitalism to you, I would say because contemporaneously it doesn't. All right. Marx's theory of class is not unique. It comes out of classical liberalism, and it is a refinement of that. It also is based off of the idea of the class in itself and the class for itself. And the class for itself would have class consciousness, a term that is not actually used by Marx all that often. It is more used by Engels and even more by Marxists after Lukács's History and Class Consciousness in 1923. And we also notice that consciousness here is not a psychological concept of consciousness, but an idea of oneself in a system of which one is conscious that enables one to change the system. Now, I'm not going to go into Lukács's theories of false consciousness, another term that Marx barely ever uses. He does use it, but not in that way and not very often. But we can see here a pretty accurate description of the way a lot of people live. We know who owns things and who has to work. Now, when you read other Marxists, there are other classes that become important. Lenin mentions the intellectua, which for him were specific intellectuals who worked for the Tsar. They were part of the overall state apparatus for Tsarist Russia. They were kind of, the administrative class employed by the state. And in theories of surplus value, it becomes clear that one can actually have multiple class positions depending on what one is doing. Marx describes the teacher who is not a prole when he is not a productive prole when he is working for the state. I'm using he because that's what Marx used, but is a proletariat in a productive capacity when he is working for a private school that draws a profit. That's a specific example which Marx used. Meaning, in one instance, the professor is in one class, and in another instance, he is in another. Because your class in Marxism is determined by your role in production, not your class of origin. If your parents were workers, do not mean you're workers, even if a working class mindset informs your ideology, nor is it just by doing labor. So, for example, petite bourgeois people who work their own subsistence and use their body, but do not draw a wage, but instead sell their skills as a labor power, as its own commodity, not as a wage, are in a different category. All right. So a contractor is not a proletarian, which does kind of strike people in common parlance as odd. But remember, Marx's locus of class is the relationship to production, and specifically social production. There's also discussion of political classes, which I think is something that often in other theories gets called something, caste or legal fiat class, although Marx refers to class struggle in societies where the economic end of social reproduction is not the primary divider of class. So there is feudal class struggle. So Marx is not actually using the caste class distinction in that way. So there are three primary facts which Marx deals with. The objective factor: class shares a common relationship to production. Subjective factors: members of the class will necessarily have some perception of their similarity and common interest. This is what Marx talked about as class consciousness, but he also talks about alienation in production, which obscures that class consciousness. And think about it. Think about this in your daily life, like in a prisoner's dilemma kind of way. Let's say you're going to your boss and you need to get a raise. Do you see yourself as working with your coworkers or against them? Well, it really depends on a whole lot of factors about the structure of that workplace and your own investment into the consciousness of your position in the working environment. Do you see yourself as united with the same people, or you're trying to get your own? Now, that's a subjective factor. Now, the objective factor of your actual relationship to means of production doesn't change that. This is why there's a distinction about classes in themselves, which is just a sociological description of what they are, and classes for themselves, which is classes that are aware of their role and can act accordingly. In other words, it sees solidarity with member in its own class. Now, the last thing is class relationships are also set up by the reproduction of class itself, or what we often refer to as social reproduction. In capitalism, the primary locus of conflict is the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. But there are many subgroups, such as the petite bourgeoisie, artisans, small shopkeepers, many professionals. The analytic Marxist John Elster, in his book, An Introduction to Karl Marx, actually finds a mention of up to 15 different classes from various historical periods. And Lenin clarifies this further. Lenin defines classes as large groups of people differing from each other by the place they occupy in the historically determined system of social production, but their relation, in most cases fixed and formulated by law, meaning caste is still part of class, to the means of production, and by the role of the organization of labor, and consequently by the visions of their share of social wealth of which they can dispose and the modes of acquiring it. Now, what Lenin does here is actually admit that there are differences within classes because they have different shares of the wealth that is accumulated in that class. So we can talk about big bourgeois and little bourgeois, not just in terms of whether or not one employs labor power, but also in terms of how much of the surplus generated in the society that the bourgeoisie can command. Think about it this way: the 0.1% versus the 1% versus the 2% versus the 3% versus the 10%. All right. Now, proletarianization in Marxism has a double meaning. And that double meaning is both being forced into the proletariat but being shut out of society, such as through private manufacturing, self-employment, other small forms that become non-viable and are crushed in the competitive wave, particularly all these kinds of artisan positions that existed in the Industrial Revolution. And then there are other groups, such as doctors, lawyers, and academics, which have subsisted on stipends or salaries from the state, are as petit bourgeois professionals, which are now increasingly working as wage labor. Now, salary in Marxism has a different meaning than it does in modern America and in Europe, and that needs to be understood. Salary in our case is whether or not you are paid hourly or in lump sum. Do you get paid for the work you do per hour, or do you get paid for the work you do per week? All right. And many times salaried professionals, for example, if you're salaried at a working class business, the difference is you don't get paid overtime. All right. But these are legal distinctions that didn't exist in Marx's time. So when people talk about the salariat now, and they just mean anyone who talks about a salary, they're talking about something different than what would have come up when Lenin used the term in Russia at the end of the 19th and the early 20th century. All right. Because the only people who got a salary in feudal societies or in early modern societies and even early capitalist societies were people who worked for the state. State workers who were granted a salary or stipend, right? That would be the police, the military, professional functionaries, etc. Now, this will bring me to what I have a problem with in the common parlance of the PMC, but I am going to talk more about this next time in how I think other classifications of class are still valid as long as you realize that they're not talking about the same thing as the Marxist classification of class. All right. And that I think we can expand the number of subdivisions that we experience in the daily life. One point made by Eric Olin Wright in Understanding Class is that people tend to hate their bosses more than they hate the owners of their businesses, because while the owners of their businesses are exploiting them, their boss is rarely actually the owner in a non-petty proprietor or non-small capitalist society. Therefore, the people who dominate them is management. Management may or may not be exploited depending on how they get paid. All right. And that is an obscuring factor in class relations. Another obscuring factor is that increasingly, since the domination of the joint stock companies, which led to the creation of what we call modern corporations, ownership of capital is structural, not individual, meaning sole proprietorship is actually somewhat rare. It's too risky. That means also who the capitalist is and their relationship to, say, CEOs and CFOs and other members of very high up management is obscured. So we need to break this down. So while I still kind of object to the PMC thesis, I do think there's a rational truth to part of it, that there are subdivisions in modern capitalism that are explanatory of aggregate traits that you can see in individuals that have, because those individuals have different interests, particularly in the cartelled parts of capital. But the problem with using cartelization, or licensure and that sort of thing, as a demarker of class is many people commonly, even many Marxists commonly consider part of the working class, are also cartelled. For example, are government salary blue collar workers working class people? Yes or no? Even people who debate about whether or not baristas and service sector workers count as working class will still include these people in, say, productive workers, and thus the proletariat. Now, as a side note, Marx never talks about productiveness being a defining element of the proletariat, and even talks about logistics and people who supply value by labor that is not producing the commodity but moving it around, facilitating its production and sale as part of the working class. So it's actually in Capital Volume 2, but it is still unclear to me if this actually describes our lived experience. And we do have to think about what Lenin says. Class should describe our lived experience of reality, but it should also be mystified. All right. And we're going to get into what that means too. Like, for example, when a lot of people that I grew up with called each other, called someone rich, they were referring to someone who was probably just in the top 40% of workers. Conversely, when people call certain professions poor, like teachers are often talked about as poorly paid, and they've been increasingly proletarianized, they are still in the top 50% income bracket in the United States. They're on the low end of that in most states. And teaching often attracts people who are generationally safe, right? Because it is such a low-paid position, it is commonly seen as woman's work. And one of the things about something being deemed woman's work is it is also deemed to be paid less, because you can expect people to have a husband who makes the money. Now, we don't live in that world at all, but the teaching world is still kind of structured that way. And many of the teachers I work with have a partner who makes more money than them and is higher up in the professional world. And that lastly gets us to one other category, which even Marx doesn't call a class, but is a subcategory of labor, which is labor aristocracy. And depending on where you're at in Marxism and which theorist you're prioritizing, that word has many different meanings. Labor aristocracy is not a word that you find in Marx, and it has at least 4 meanings. It was a phrase that was used by Engels and highly popularized in both Kautsky and Lenin. Lenin used it in Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. Kautsky used it in his 1901 work. It is a controversial position even within Marxism, but it has 4 different common uses in Marxism, and they're not copacetic with each other. One is a theoretical term of, say, of in Engels and Kautsky, and then later Vladimir Lenin, related to a specific kind of trade unionism, where trade union leaders and people within the trade union would argue for benefits against the interest of people in their sector. All right. Engels talked about labor aristocracy as being a problem of the British working class, and why the British working class does not see themselves largely as part of the global proletariat. Kautsky uses it similarly, and really popularized it in 1901, picking up from Lenin. Lenin uses it a little differently and led to a tradition that was really developed out in Third-Worldists, Third-Worldist Marxist-Leninist-Maoism, as opposed to Marxist-Leninist-Maoists. They don't thought these ideologies would require their own explainer video, but I'm trying to be as accurate as who uses them as possible. Where companies paid their workers not above exploitation levels, but higher, because they were able to exploit other workers and where wages were much lower, and it used the difference in regional purchasing power and the ability to push workers farther in other areas where there were less legal protections to kind of leverage the developed working class against the undeveloped working class. Now, Lenin did not go far to say is labor aristocracy was unexploited. He didn't say that. That is a theory that's worked out by third worldist interpretations of Marxist-Leninism. Maoism, third worldism are Marxist-Leninism, Maoism, third worldism, and that idea is an idea that came out of Liam Bao and Three Worlds theory. Now, I've mocked Three Worlds theory. Three Worlds appears up and even misrepresented now because the first world included the Soviet Union, according to Liam Bao, during the Sino-Soviet split. So you can tell that there's a lot of this theory is being driven by immediate political debates within the People's Republic of China. And the second definition, though, is a more specific version of, the third definition is a more specific version of the first definition used by Engels and Kautsky, which that the business unions and trade guilds developed coming out of medieval systems even, were labor aristocratic, whereas industrial unions, which try to organize an entire sector of the economy, or at least an entire industry, were not aristocratic, meaning they had the interest of all the workers in the field and not just workers who worked in a specific craft within a field. And if you want to see examples of where this still happens, the railway unions are broken down into business and craft unions. Now, business unions in the IWW are an expanded concept, which means like unions that are controlled by, say, the National Labor Relations Board and Taft-Hartley-Jackson Duff Legal. But originally, even in the IWW, they referred mostly to the American Federation of Labor, which did not admit unskilled or semi-skilled mass production workers, but only specialists. All right. So the IWW called these people labor aristocrats. The reason why labor aristocracy is kind of controversial is because there is a way in which the Maoist-Third-Worldist definition says that workers in the developed world are just not exploited at all, going way further than Lenin did. Lenin talked about super profits and hyper exploitation of workers in the periphery, but did not think of it as something completely separate, and that workers in the core were unexploited. That is a later theory imposed upon them. And in fact, while this is generally believed to be a Maoist-only belief, most Trotskyists prior to the 1970s also believed in labor aristocracy. The early Congresses of the Fourth International accepted the Lenin version of the labor aristocracy theory, including Ernst Mandel and Tony Cliff. But they saw that as different than the mistaken third worldist argument, which goes further and says that the labor, the developed world's proletariat is not exploited at all. Now, I went into that side tangent, and it's a long one, to talk about, some areas of ambiguity in Marxist class theory, and there's several. But there is real clarity in the driving class conflict between those who own property, productive property, i.e. capital, and those who don't and have to sell their labor power to them, and then different groups who have kind of mitigated relations in between. And it's the mitigated relations in between that have led to all kinds of new class theories, some of which I think are more legitimate than others, not because they are more Marxist or not, but because they are more coherent, right? When I talk about class theories, I just clear that we make the criterion of what we're deciding what the classes are clear. All right. The objective, subjective, and social reproduction correlates of Marxist class theory are clear. We know what we're talking about. All right. Now, it doesn't make it obvious, but it is coherent. Whereas there are other class theories that I just think are so vague, they're not useful, are describe things only on one vector, such as income and income brackets, which are relative but will exist in any society that has any income or wealth differentials at all. It's not necessarily explaining of either the divisions of labor or political divisions in the society, which is often why they're favored as a government way to talk about these things, because it makes it harder to talk about other power relationships in class. But we're going to talk about other theories of class that I think are helpful for understanding the world as we experience them beyond the Marxist one, and can even supplement and help the Marxist one, as long as you remember what the Marxist one is actually describing. And with that, like and subscribe and continue to nail it down. I would like to thank my patrons who are high-level patron subscribers of the Kano Kohanan level. I would like to give a shout out to my newest Kano Kohanan, Jonah H. I want to thank you, Jonah, and all my Kano Kohanans for making this possible. All right. Like and subscribe, hit the bell, etc., and so forth. And with that, good day.